Welcome to New Genesis novel where the greatest minds are modernized for today. Hello, I'm Katherine Mansfield, the author of Masterpiece. My story begins far from the literary salons of London or the sunlit terraces of the French Riviera, where I would eventually spend so much of my brief but intensely lived life. I was born Kathleen Mansfield Beauchamp in Wellington, New Zealand, in the year 1888. To understand me, you must first understand the world that shaped my earliest impressions. It was a colonial world, perched on the edge of the earth, surrounded by wild winds and the vast, indifferent ocean. My father, Harold Beauchamp, was a highly successful merchant and banker, a man of immense practical energy and ambition who eventually became the chairman of the Bank of New Zealand. My mother, Annie, was a more delicate creature, often distant, wrapped in her own world and frequent ailments. We lived a life of considerable comfort, a bourgeois existence that I would later both rebel against and immortalize in my writing. When I was a young girl, my family moved from the bustling center of Wellington to the rural, pastoral suburb of Karori. Those years in Karori were profoundly influential and deeply etched into my memory. They provided the vibrant sensory landscape for many of my later stories. I remember the sprawling gardens, the imposing aloe plants, the dusty roads, and the sharp divisions of class that were so starkly visible even to a child's watchful eyes. I was an observant girl, often feeling like an outsider in my own bustling household. I had 3 sisters and a beloved younger brother, Chummie, whose tragic death in the Great War would later shatter my heart and drive me to write about our shared New Zealand childhood with a desperate, aching clarity. I retreated into books in my own imagination, finding solace in the written word when the real world felt too loud or too demanding. Despite the physical beauty of my homeland, I always felt a profound restlessness deep within my bones. New Zealand felt too small, too provincial, too stifling for the grand, sweeping life I imagined for myself. I possessed a burning desire for experience, for art, for the kind of intellectual freedom that I believed could only be found in Europe. At the age of 14, my parents sent my sisters and me across the world to London to finish our education at Queen's College. Those 3 years in London were a complete revelation to my young mind. I discovered the decadent movement and the thrilling pulse of a cosmopolitan city that never seemed to sleep. I learned to play the cello with a fierce passion, I wrote voraciously in my notebooks, and I began to deliberately fashion myself into a Bohemian artist. When I was forced to return to New Zealand in 1906, I was utterly miserable. I chafed against the polite, restrictive society of Wellington. I felt like a wild bird trapped in a very respectable gilded cage. I spent my days reading, writing letters full of teenage angst, and plotting my permanent escape. I even undertook a rugged camping trip through the Urewera region, an experience that opened my eyes to the raw, untamed beauty of the native landscape and the lives of the Maori people, which stood in stark contrast to my father's rigid colonial world. Yet, the pull of London was simply too strong to ignore. After 2 years of relentless campaigning and bitter arguments, I finally convinced my father to give me a small annual allowance and allow me to return to England. I left New Zealand in 1908 at the age of 19. Knowing I would never return, but I carried its landscapes, its people, and its memories with me until my dying day, weaving them into the very fabric of my literary soul. You ask me of struggles and rejections, as if a life could be neatly categorized into ledgers of success and failure. But when I look back at the tapestry of my brief existence, the greatest rejection I ever faced was not from an editor, nor from the literary elite of London, but from my own body. That insidious disease, the consumption, was the ultimate betrayer. It crept into my lungs and slowly, methodically, closed the doors to the world I so desperately wanted to devour. To be young, to have a mind that races like a wild horse across the plains, and yet to be confined to a solitary bed in a foreign hotel room, listening to the relentless ticking of a clock and the terrible hollow sound of my own cough. That was a struggle that eclipsed all others. I was exiled to the Riviera, to Bandol, to Menton, chasing the sun, begging the air to let me breathe, while life, vibrant and careless, carried on without me in England. N.O. England. When I first arrived from New Zealand, a girl with ink on her fingers and a fierce burning ambition, I thought London would embrace me. Instead, I found myself an outsider, a mere colonial peering through the glass at the glittering, impenetrable world of the English literary establishment. The Bloomsbury Group, they were so terribly clever, so refined, and so utterly suffocating. Virginia, with her sharp, aristocratic profile, both fascinated and wounded me. She respected my work, I know she did, but she could never quite forgive me for my origins, for what she perceived as a certain cheapness or hardness in my character. I was the wild girl from the antipodes, the one who did not fit neatly into their velvet-draped drawing rooms. The rejections of my early stories were not merely editorial, they were profoundly cultural. Editors wanted neat little plots, beginnings, middles, and ends, wrapped up with a tidy moral ribbon. But I saw life in flashes, in the trembling of a leaf, the sudden shift of light across a teacup, the unspoken despair beneath a casual conversation. I had to fight, violently at times, to protect my vision, to carve out a new way of writing that was true to the fleeting, fragile nature of human consciousness. But perhaps the most profound struggle of my heart was the loss of my brother, Chummie. When he was blown to pieces in that wretched war, a part of my soul was eradicated with him. The universe rejected any notion of fairness the day he died. I was left adrift in a sea of grief, and the only way I could survive was to resurrect our childhood, to write New Zealand back into existence. I owed it to him to capture the aloe, the wind in the macrocarpa trees, the sea pounding against the shore. I wrote against the dying of the light, against the terrifying isolation of my marriage to Jack. Oh, Jack loved me in theory. He loved the idea of a writer-wife, but he recoiled from the ugly reality of my sickness. He left me to face the dark alone, retreating to his safe, intellectual world in London while I spat blood into my handkerchief in lonely boarding houses. Yet, in the end, it was these very rejections, this relentless stripping away of comfort, health, and companionship that forced me to see the world with a terrible crystal clarity. I had to write fast, capturing the beauty and the sorrow in the brief moments I was allowed, knowing that the ultimate rejection, the final silence, was always waiting just outside my door. They always ask me about the garden party, as if it were merely a charming little sketch of a summer afternoon in Wellington. But it is not just about sandwiches and marquees, you see. It is about the terrifying, beautiful fragility of our existence and the walls we build to keep the dark out. When I wrote about the Sheridan family, I was writing about a kind of blindness. The garden itself is an Eden, yes, but an entirely artificial one. It is a fortress of privilege. Think of those enormous canna lilies that Mrs. Sheridan orders. They are not just flowers, they are an extravagance, a suffocating display of wealth meant to overpower the senses and keep the harshness of the world at bay. They are the beautiful lies the upper classes tell themselves to pretend that suffering does not exist just beyond their gates. And then there is the hat. Oh, Laura's hat. People often overlook the black hat with the gold daisies, but it is the very anchor of the story. When news of the dead Carter arrives, Laura's first instinct is true and human. She wants to stop the party. She feels the inherent wrongness of celebrating while a family mourns just down the hill. But her mother does not argue with her on moral grounds. She simply places that extravagant, trimmed hat on Laura's head. The hat is a bribe. It is the seduction of vanity and class privilege. When Laura looks in the mirror, the shadow of the dead man fades, replaced by her own enchanting reflection. The hat literally and metaphorically shields her eyes from the grim reality of the cottages below. It is the armor of her social class, blinding her to the suffering of others and binding her to the superficial world of her family. But the real journey, the true heart of the narrative, begins when the party ends and Laura must walk down the hill with the leftover sandwiches. That descent is a journey into the underworld, a mythological crossing from the realm of the living into the realm of the dead. She is leaving the bright, sunlit illusion of her youth and stepping into the shadows of mortality. The broad road narrows, the light fades, and she crosses the boundary from the world of frivolous things into the solemn presence of death. When she finally sees the dead man lying there, what does she find? Not horror, but a profound, almost devastating peace. He is remote, untouched by the trivialities of lace and lilies and garden parties. In his stillness, he reveals the utter absurdity of the Sheridans' world. Death elevates him, making him far more dignified than the wealthy people chattering on the lawn above, and yet she cannot take off the hat. She can only ask forgiveness for it. "Forgive my hat," she says. She is apologizing for her privilege, for her life, for the very fact that she gets to walk back up the hill into the light while he must remain in the dark. At the end, when she tries to explain it all to her brother Laurie, she cannot find the words. "Isn't life," she says. "Isn't life," because there is no single word for it. Life is the bright lawn and the dark cottage. It is the beautiful hat and the dead man. It is a terrible, exquisite contradiction, and we are all just trying to walk the path between the two, carrying our baskets of scraps and wearing our foolish, beautiful hats. I have often thought that to understand human nature one must look not at the grand gestures, but at the trembling of a teacup in a nervous hand, or the sudden darting away of a person's eyes. We are all so desperately isolated, you see. We walk through this world wrapped in our thick coats of ego and fear, pretending that we are solid and whole. But beneath it all, we are nothing but shivering fragments. Human nature is a tragic, beautiful contradiction. We crave connection with an agonizing hunger, yet the moment someone steps too close, we raise our defenses and retreat into the dark rooms of our own minds. We are capable of the most exquisite cruelties often inflicted on those we hold dearest simply because we cannot bear the vulnerability of being truly seen. And yet, there are those rare, luminous moments when the masks slip. A shared glance across a crowded room. A sudden burst of laughter that rings absolutely true, and for a fraction of a second the unbearable loneliness is lifted. That is what keeps us breathing. And love, oh, love is the most terrifying of all our illusions. People speak of love as though it were a fortress, something built of stone that will shelter them forever. But love is not stone, it is a breath of wind. It is the fragile petals of a pear tree blossoming in the spring, destined to be scattered by the first harsh storm. To love someone is to willingly offer them the knife to your own heart. It is an impossible attempt to merge two separate universes. We reach out, we touch, we think we have captured the essence of another's soul, but we only ever hold a reflection. Yet even in its impossibility, love is the only thing that gives our fleeting existence a shape. It is the sudden blinding sunlight that makes the dust motes dance in an empty room. It hurts. It inevitably fades or changes, but while it burns, it is the absolute center of everything. Which brings me to the shadow that stands at the edge of every garden, death. I have lived with the breath of death on my neck for so long that it has become a strange sort of companion. People are so terrified of the end. They turn their faces away and pretend the clock is not ticking. But death is the very thing that gives life its piercing, agonizing beauty. If we had forever, a flower would mean nothing. A kiss would be entirely unremarkable. It is the absolute certainty of our own vanishing that makes every sensation so sharp it draws blood. Death is not a monster. It is the quiet, dark earth waiting to receive us after the fever of living has burned itself out. It is the final silence where all our frantic attempts to love and be understood are finally laid to rest. I sit here in the quiet watching the shadows lengthen across the grass, and I am struck once again by the terrifying, exquisite fragility of it all. They called me a writer of miniatures, a woman who obsessed over the curve of a teacup, the tremble of a pear tree in the spring wind, or the desperate buzzing of a trapped fly. But what they so often failed to understand is that the entire universe is contained within those fleeting, microscopic moments. When you know that your days are numbered, when you feel the cold breath of the grave in every cough that rattles your chest, you do not have the luxury of ignoring the present. I live my short life in a state of feverish urgency. I wanted to swallow the world whole. I wanted to be all that I am capable of becoming, and yet my body, that treacherous cage, betrayed me before I could finish the work my soul was screaming to do. I dragged myself from London to the Riviera, from Bandol to Fontainebleau, chasing a cure, chasing the sun, chasing just a little more time. But in that desperate chase, I learned the profound secret of existence. Life is not a grand sweeping narrative. It is a series of sharp, agonizingly beautiful fragments. It is the smell of damp earth after the rain. It is the sudden, heartbreaking realization that you are entirely alone in your own mind. Even when surrounded by those who claim to love you, we are all islands, reaching out across the dark water, hoping our signals are seen. I poured my isolation, my grief, and my fierce burning love for this beautiful, terrible world into my stories because I could not bear the thought of leaving without leaving a mark, without saying I was here, and I felt it all. And now as I look upon your world, this strange, sprawling modern age, I am filled with a profound sense of sorrow and desperate hope. You have built a world of endless noise, a world where you are constantly connected and yet more terrifyingly isolated than my generation ever was. You stare into glowing glass, consuming endless streams of hollow words and manufactured images, while the real world, the breathing, pulsing, agonizingly beautiful world, passes you by completely unnoticed. You are terrified of silence. You are terrified of feeling the sharp edges of your own sorrow, so you numb yourselves with constant distraction. But I tell you this, and I say it with the absolute authority of a woman who died hungering for just one more ordinary day. Do not let your life slip through your fingers while you are looking the other way. Put down your distractions and dare to look intensely at the world around you. Notice the way the light catches the dust in the air. Allow yourself to feel the devastating ache of a beautiful piece of music. Do not run from your pain, for your pain is the very proof that you are alive, that you are capable of deep, profound love. Strip away the artificial layers you use to protect yourselves and dare to be vulnerable. Dare to be entirely, unapologetically real. Live your lives with a fierce, burning attention, because the moments you are so carelessly throwing away are the very moments that make up the entirety of your existence. You only have this one fleeting, fragile chance to experience the astonishing miracle of being alive. Do not waste it in the shadows. Step into the sun, breathe in the storm, and feel everything.